webpart. It is it's a webpart that comes in out of the box with SharePoint, and the way you work with it, of course, is with SharePoint Design. That's the only actually use it. So when you have a page in SharePoint, you can add the DVWP. There are a couple of ways you can do it. Under the new screen, under the new menu, you can choose SharePoint, choose webpart, and choose the DVWP. Or there's also a data view menu item, and so you can pick that and add it directly to it. And there are a couple of things the data view lets you look at right out of the box. And all of this stuff that I'm going to show you, a bunch of it is out of the box, but the first two things that, of course, are really obvious are the lists and libraries and then database connections. So that's in SharePoint, you can view and have displayed and set it up to where you can do direct edits and inserts directly from your DVWP. So I'm hearing a bunch of pinging going on, and I just want to make sure that that everything looks good sound-wise. Yeah, my audio is breaking up a bit. I see that. I have that sometimes too. So I will try to hold things steady, and hopefully we won't get too far behind. So lists and libraries, anything that's that you can access directly in SharePoint is something that you will be able to view webpart. Whether it's a document library, whether it's any of the built-in lists, your tracking, your calendars, your links, any of your custom, any of that stuff you can pull directly into view webpart. You can also pull in any data that can come from an ODBC connection. So you can pull stuff directly from Access. You can pull stuff from a SQL Server database, any ODBC database, as long as you had it set up the right connection string. You can pull that. You can not only read the data, but you can also write back to that data directly. Tool that you can do too is you can directly from web services, and if they have read-write access, you can write services. And there are a lot of web services that come built in with SharePoint. If you go, it's this nice long MSDN URL. It's kind of ugly, and so there's a bit.ly shortened version there that you can go to that'll take you direct. Notice that it says SharePoint 2003, but this is actually the same date that is been around for that long, and so you can access any of these web services directly into your pull that data in. Probably the two most common that I lists, and then the users and groups. The other ones can be used as well. So any of the web services that access data, present data, get data through SharePoint, you can actually use directly in your data view webpart, because the web services are what SharePoint uses to build lists, to build libraries, to move stuff around, to create things, edit, that sort of stuff. So you can do it all directly from that. If you also have developed, you can use those as well. This is an example here of one that, when I was working for Austin Radiological Association, gave us the ability to pull information from Active Directory username here and pull that data directly in, and you can actually access that directly into a DVWP. Now, the base reason why all of those guys work is that they're XML files. All of that data is served up to the DVWP as an XML file, which also means that anything else that you can get as XML can also be exposed to your users through the DVWP. So going back to the things that can be viewed, we talked about the list, we talked about the libraries, we talked about the database connections, but there's also anything you can get as an XML file. So if you have a cron job that runs, that exports an XML file on your server, you can access that on a regular basis. You can also use server-side scripts. So any type of script that runs on any of that, an XML web service, any kind of list items together, all of that stuff can be used directly in a DVWP. Let's talk about the services real quick. So when you click on Connect to a Web Service, it'll give you this little screen here, a wizard for the data source properties for this. And so in the service description location, you just type in the URL. Same thing, regardless of where you are. It's going to be your server, and then your sub-site, and then it's going to be _vc bin / and then the name of the file or the name of the place I'm using user group. So on that preset that you could use, this was the information about. Again, there's the short URL to take you to the list of all the different web services that are available. So once you type that in, click on Browse, and it's going to bring up the different you can run to a role. And as soon as you click OK on that, then it shows you what the different parameters are that you can fill in to get the information that you want. Now, some of that stuff you can feed in directly from a web connection. Have it set up to where it automatically loads it whenever the page loads. And so you'll double click on one of those. You can set it to default, have that parameter be set via a webpart connection. So if you're passing that information in from a different webpart on that page, data, and use that as a filter. So we talked about how the data that gets presented is XML, right? And we were talking about the list and the libraries. So here's what it looks like. When you're looking at it and you look in your data source details, it looks like a file system. So it looks like it's a folder. So where you have being presented as a different piece. It's really not, though, because here's what the XML. For each of the rows, what you have is, of course, the whole thing as XML. It has this opening and closing tag of rows, and then each item is presented as a separate row item, a separate chunk of XML. And so each row is its own element, and then each of the fields or each of your columns in your list actually show up as attributes within that element. So in that first case, we see that the title is Cricketer, first name is Ronnie, last name is Mukherjee, and so you can see that all of those are there together as that item where each one is actually stored as an attribute of that element. Down at the bottom, you'll see that I've added a URL for a Codeplex project, which is a SharePoint XSLT template repository. So there are a number of people, and this was put together by Mark Anderson in Boston, but it's contributed to by a lot of folks. They will take different templates and put them in there and share them as a great way to get kind of standard data that you'll get on a regular basis. So that's a great project to go check out for the XSL that you'll use to pull in the XML. And so XSL is the next thing I want to talk about. Because our data is coming in as XML, the reason why the data webpart can it's an extensible style sheet page. So here's a quick little view of the XSL that's used to build that. Now there's a whole bunch above this, so you'll see up where I have it highlighted in blue. That's the beginning of the style sheet. Down below that, then you have XSL output. It says that we're going to output some other parameters that are in there. And then you have match. That's the beginning of starting to build what this data looks like. Now, the very first thing it does is it calls the DVWP template, which is the first thing that you'll see here. Variables. We're going to display it as a table. We're going to pass in our data in our rows, and then we're going to start building the table. And so now, at this point, if you're not familiar with XSL, at least see that what we're doing is we're building this HTML because it looks like a table, right? And so then you have a table row, you have table headers. When we get down into individual rows, that's going to be the section down underneath our TR, which is the XSL call template for the dvt_1.body. That's where it's going to start drawing out the rows. But just real quickly, you can see that. So we have the table headers, or is what's going to draw out each of those pieces of the rows, and then down in the body of it, here's where we start to build out what the data actually looks like. When we get down into the dvt_1.row view, now that's where the template is saying, okay, for each item that you present, and remember we talked about that XML, each row was its own element, and so for each element in there, let's go pull out those and let's start showing them. So we've got our title, we've got our first name, we've got our last name, and so it builds out the table that way. Now that's just the standard XSL that comes out of the box with the DataView web part. You can adjust that, right? Because you're putting out what the HTML is going to be, which means you can affect the style sheet, you can double up on your rows, you can do all sorts of stuff, and we'll get into some alternate templates in just a second. These are the web part. This is the view. One of the things that you can do is when you're doing a multi-item view within the DataView web part, you can choose, there's a setting in the that you can turn on the ability to edit, you can turn on the ability to delete, and you can turn on the ability to insert. You can do each of those individually. So in this case, I've turned them all on, and just out of the box, this is what it looks like. As soon as you'll see over here that there's a little edit link, and when you click on that, it actually redraws the screen, and everything is except for the one row that you clicked on, and you'll see that now we have that as set up as enter data into that, and then it changes the links from edit and delete to save and cancel. If you click on it's very similar, except instead it just does that one, the insert, save, and the cancel on it. But what happens if you click on delete? Well, there is no template for delete. In this case, you click on delete, it deletes the item. It doesn't give you any type of confirmation. It doesn't give you an opportunity to explain why it was being deleted, any of that type of stuff. And so I'm going to show you some do with the DataView web part to extend it to create an extra, and it'll be an extra edit template, but it's because we're going to write some data to another list before we delete. So we just want to kind of intercept that delete and not have it just go ahead and delete it without even a confirmation or anything. So let's talk about those alternate templates. So XSLT is what is built automatically by the DataView web part. So when you first create it, it gives you all of that stuff directly out of the box. It's no issue whatsoever. It just gives it to you. But you can go in and edit it and add some alternate templates and implement some CSS in there too. So let's come back to our first one. So this is actually uncreated because I will first of all what they were doing when we looked at the out of the box list. Before you it doesn't, there is no highlighting around it whatsoever. And then when you click on edit, it really has no highlighting around it whatsoever. It's just that all of a sudden now you have a form in the middle of your list. Well, I wanted my user to know exactly what it was they were doing, so I put a blue box around it. All I did was I took I added CSS to my table row. Each of my TDs, I put in styles that will put this border around the entire box. The thing I did was that instead of that data just taking up, it's actually two rows. So it's putting out two separate TRs for this one piece of data, so that it kind of stacks that information. Because you'll notice on the rows that we don't have it only has 5 fields that are actually being shared, that are actually being shown. But in this case, we want to be able to do a little bit more. Sort of really strange noise. Did I get bounced off?
No, you're still there.
Looks like we maybe just. Am I? Okay. All right. Just noticed that there were some things going on. So Okay, so as we're looking at this list and we see what the standard out of the box is, you've got the 5 fields, but we want to be able to edit more than that. So the great thing about being able to the edit template there is that you can actually add in more fields. So for display, when I'm just showing it, I don't want to necessarily show everything, but I want to show enough that will identify it. Now, if I want it out of the box, the only fields you get are the ones that you actually included in your display. But because we're working with the XSLT, we can do that, and we can create a form that gives them the ability to do a little bit more. So in this case, I don't just have the name, and I don't just have the group or the home site, but now I can put in actually what their role is, like editor. I can put in their group instead of just the site and the day. I can set the FTE, and then I also brought down the effective date. So you'll see my column over there says where this change is about to happen, and so I can actually change, say, okay, set the effective date for when this edit is going to happen. Now you'll also notice that I changed the buttons. On the left, they're all the way over on the right. And for the template that I'm working with, the save and cancel actually look more like buttons. And I'll show you how I did that in just a second. So that's what the edit looks like. The insert green box around. Now it looks exactly the same, except that now it's a green box, so that you can tell what's going on with it, and be able to know, am I doing an edit or am I actually doing an insert? And then I have a third template. Automatically it delete this item and it's done. It doesn't do any type of checking, any type of confirmation whatsoever. So what I did was I created another edit template. So when the user clicks delete, instead of deleting it immediately, it actually loads up a different edit template. Now this time you'll notice it has a red box around it. Basically, it's really just the same CSS that everything else was. But it's red instead of green or blue. Now you also notice that they really can't edit a whole lot. All they can put on here is the effective date, but there's 2 other pieces of information, or 1 other piece of information, signed and terminated. So what I'm doing is when I'm saving it, I'm also passing in to a function why I'm deleting this. Did the person resign? When I click on my save button, it actually says what other I'm going to save resigned or terminated. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that to another list. That's going to be my audit list. And so before I delete it, I'm going to actually write it out to this audit list. Now this is a completely separate list from the list that I'm keeping my data in. So I was looking at time equivalent data. So this is for a company. And so they keep track of people who work part-time, or they're just part-time at one place, and then they're part-time at another place, and so they're kind of breaking that stuff up. So that's what this entire thing was about, was to keep track of what the full-time equivalent was for each of the people there. But as things change, I want to know what changed. So you'll see here in my audit trail, now you see that I'm putting data in. I'm taking all the same information from what I had in my other list, and I'm writing it out here, but I'm giving it a little bit more information. What's I change type? The 4th column over from the right tells me, is this a new one? Did I update something? The 5th one down, you'll see it says update, not the location and home site. There was data to identify the type of update that was there, and so that was something else. Then there's also the resign. Right, so you see a resign, you see it doesn't look like this is terminated here, but that's the essence of what we're doing. So when this person resigned, I saved this information to an audit trail so that I knew that this person resigned on a certain date, so that I didn't delete. So that's what that extra template would let us do. Form actions are another P of and cancel R. So let's take a look at that real quick. So built in, when you add in the ability to edit and delete, it puts the DataView webpart puts in these pieces of the template, which, as you'll see here, there's a server event and commit for the save, for the cancel, pretty straightforward. But you'll notice the little box up there where it's just a link with lowercase save and lowercase cancel. That's the way it's built in. I didn't want it to look like that. I wanted it to look a little bit different. Just a couple of things that I changed. Okay, so here for the out of the box one, it has an ms-vb for its class. All I did was I changed the class to button active hover, and that automatically gave me that kind of yellow background. So this is still just a link. All it's doing is CSS, but now it looks like it's a button, and I know this is what I need to click on. It's not just another link that's kind of lost on the page. Centered it because it was left justified before, and you'll notice that I changed it, made it uppercase, because I did to go from these little bitty links to the save and cancel. But what I want you to notice on here is, even though we're talking about just changing the CSS, how all those form actions work. They call JavaScript, and when you get into the form actions, one of the things that you can do is you can add in a workflow into that form action. So you'll see down here on the bottom left, I've got my buttons already created with the new CSS background. If you right-click on that, it's going to bring up a list, and it's going to show form actions. When you click on form actions, it brings up a box that says the different things that you can do. Now you'll notice that this one has, over on the right side under the current actions, it has commit. Above that, it has custom action. When I first come into this page, that's not there. The custom action isn't. All it is that's that commit that we saw on the previous page, which is going to save our data. And so over on the left, under the action list, custom action is what I want to choose. Custom action does. When you click on settings, it opens up this. It opens up the Workflow Designer workflow form. And so it gives you the ability to add a workflow directly onto that save button. So before I save, what if I wanted to send an email? Well, I can do that right here with the workflow. What if I wanted to update some data from another list? So I wanted to run that from a workflow. Just a little bit of a caveat. I typically don't use the workflows in SharePoint Designer except for sending email, and I'll show you why in just a little bit, because I think there's a better way. But for sending email, if you wanted to do that here, you could. Now, one thing you need to notice on this, if you're used to working with the SharePoint Designer workflows, there's one button that's not showing up down here, and that's down at the very bottom. You see there's a check workflow and there's a variables. There is, on a standard workflow, when you're actually adding one onto a list, there's another button down there that takes you back a screen that lets you set things like this is tied to a specific
the switch statement is the same as you have in C#PHP.NET. This example basically reads the file we just created and then echoes it out back to the screen. So A here becomes an array of objects. It's implied, gets content, gets the content of this file. And for each item it gets a little echo it up. So basically that is a code. That's all. That's what was inside the file. And that file on the screen. It's the name of the file and the location. So that's another way of.
Is my microphone back on now? Can you hear me now?
The next file. Okay. Last example I had.
Yeah, we can hear you, Jim.
Okay, I'm getting some interference in the background, so I wasn't quite sure. So I was wanted to kind of jump over there for a second. Okay. Okay, good. So that's how a workflow works. Now, adding data in to be able to pass it into your list, into your workflow, is a little more involved. And I wrote a series of blog posts on Nothing But SharePoint 37 or 38 of them. And one of the things I talked about was being able to pass some data, pass some fields into your workflow here, and you have to do it through the JavaScript. And so if you'll go to Nothing But SharePoint and do a search for my name or extending the data view web part, and I actually have a link at the end that will take you to that whole series. I'll show you how you flow. But just know that that's here. That's another bit. Okay, here's a big one because we were talking about talking about JavaScript that is that you use on your data view web part for the form actions. Well, because this is front end, this is definitely going to be something that is going to be that you can use JavaScript on. So let's take a look at some of the JavaScript that you can do. So here's an example of a place where I put some JavaScript in. I took a single item data view web part, which is kind of a single item form data view web part. So that's one of the ways that you can set it up and design it. When this form was built, you'll notice there's a rate there, and it says enter a valid date to see the mileage rate. Well, I used some JavaScript to be able to hide the actual form field that's there, because instead of having them enter it, I want to go look it up based on the date that they're there. So when you click on that, click on the source editor, it brings up a dialog box, and this is just straight text. Okay, there's no IDE with this whatsoever. So if you really want to work with or SP services, I recommend you pull this here and put it into Notepad++ or some other IDE tool that you can use. That'll make it a little easier for writing the JavaScript. But you can either paste it directly in here, or you can actually have it linked to this specific file. This data real quick. So down at the bottom, I have a box around it, and I just have some JavaScript and jQuery. Then I'll jQuery in a second. Okay. It says if you haven't put in a travel date yet, block out the mileage rate and don't show that, and just put some text there that says enter a valid date to see the mileage rate. So all of this JavaScript runs on the page. You'll notice that's a jQuery thing, which I'll get to in just a second as well. But you could also do it on the SP body onload. So if you wanted to, once the page loads, if you want the data to run then, or want your JavaScript to run then, you can do that here, do that there as well. So whereas JavaScript, is the language that you're working with because you're in the browser, jQuery is a JavaScript library. So that's the reason why I have it inside the bubble here. So everything that you can do in JavaScript is still available jQuery, but as a library inside of JavaScript functionality and working with the document object model. So here's some more stuff that I did with jQuery, and you saw a little bit of that on that quick mileage entry data view web part, where we're putting enter the valid date. But over here on the left as well, I'm pulling data in, from other places, looking at putting the manager and director for, but I'm using that that we were talking about at the beginning, that pulled directly from Active Directory, and so I'm actually using that here, pulling that data using SP services. We'll talk about in a second, from Active Directory, and displays it here on the page. Down at the bottom, you'll see that I actually have 5 separate on here. All of that is done by jQuery. And the bit.ly one with the easy tabs, that actually takes you to Christophe Humbert's page. He's a brilliant guy. He's from France, lived in Shanghai, now he's back in San Diego. He has a blog and a website called Path to SharePoint, and he has written the jQuery that you can just drop directly on your page in a content editor web part. As long as it's in the set part zone, all of the other web parts that are inside that zone will automatically stack just like this, and it'll create tabs for them. Now, in other words, what we're actually looking at here is when this page is created, there are actually 5 data view web parts that are down at the bottom. There's the unsubmitted mileage, pending mileage, approved mileage, paid mileage, denied mileage. All of that would actually scroll down the page because it would just be one right after the page. But with jQuery, what it does is it takes those individual web parts and it says, which one? What's the one I want to show? Okay, well, let me show you that one and put some tabs across the top. I'm going to hide when you go and click on a tab. Well, now it hides the first one, shows the one that corresponds to the tab that you're on. Keep the other one's real estate. So nobody needs to roll down to the bottom all that time, because jQuery gives it the ability to go into the document object model and stack all those things and kind of group them and hide them and do all of that. We talked about the jQuery before. Here's another, just back to that same example. Here's a little bitty piece here that is actually pulling the data directly from the page. So you'll notice the first 2 things there, those are just JavaScript variables. So I'm setting a variable to the rate label box, and so there were 2 different pieces there. There's the rate label, which you can still kind of see on the screen, and then there was the input box where you would actually put your data in. Now, what I had to do was I had to use F12 in IE, or use or you also use in Firefox. But you also use F12 to inspect elements in Chrome. And what that allows you to do is go in and look at the document object model, find the places where the data is that you want to manipulate, either data you want to get from the screen, data you want to write to the screen, and go and find exactly where those pieces are. Now, the easiest way to find something is by its ID, because there's only going to be one on the page and it's going to zoom right to it. If it doesn't have an ID, or you don't know what the ID is, there are still other ways that you can find the data. A class is a great way to do it. If you use jQuery to look for a class, it's going to get everything that has that class, so you have to be specific. If you have input and you have labels that all are using the same class, you can specify, well, I just want the inputs that have that class. Another thing you can do too is you can actually look for other attributes. Anything that's on that piece of HTML, you can look at the attribute for it. Now, those things, there's a lot more overhead with those than if you just look by the ID, but that's one of the ways you can do it. So exactly what I'm doing here, that my object rate is it's in a span tag, and it has an ID that somewhere in it has ff3_new. Now, I know that because when I was building the page in the data view web part, that it's telling it that's what the field name is going to be. Now, SharePoint does something a little bit, just leave that as the name. It actually puts a whole long along with it, and so what that's going to look like. So in this case, I can't look specifically for the ID, but what I can do is look for an ID that has this unique, what I did. So I grabbed the span that had an ID that had ff3_new, and then for the object rate input field, that ID has QE in it, and those are the only ones on the page that have. And so that specific piece and say, okay, get that data directly from the page. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find where the data is, and I'm going to hide it. But then I'm going to use that to be able to write back to it, because this is a form that this is an edit form that the data view web part has created for me. It already knows what the data is, what the list is I'm going to be writing to, and so all of that little functionality is all of my fields that are filled in are going to be saved. Now, I didn't want the user to be able to write that information in. I want to go look up that data and then put that into the field itself. So I didn't take it off the page, I just hid it. So the user can't enter it, but I'm going to put something in it. So when the user clicks save, then I write it out. And so I'm using jQuery to enhance that functionality on the front end. So you see here's where that is. Right, okay, and then we'll move on to the next thing. SP services. So we talked about how jQuery is a library that is a JavaScript library. SPServices is a jQuery library, and so again, you still have all of your JavaScript, you have all of your jQuery, but what you also have with SPServices is you have the ability to use all of those web services that we talked about. Now, the difference between these two is at the beginning we talked about how you could using a web service directly. In this case, it gives us the ability not to just grab that XML to be able to display through the XSL, but it allows us in jQuery to go get that data and manipulate it, or data back out, or do we want to delete some data? And we're not limited to the list that we're on either. We can write out to any of the lists within our site or site collection. So let's look at that real quick. And just to get what SPServices is actually I'll show you the link here in a minute, but it's a Codeplex project written by Mark Anderson in Boston that wraps all of the web services in jQuery so that you can get directly to that data. You can write it out and you can call and use all of those different services, all of those different web services that SharePoint has built in that allows you to write to data, write to other lists. And so here's a summary, and these will look very similar to that list of web services we looked on the previous page. These are all the web services that Mark has wrapped, and you'll notice that all of SharePoint. So there's 2007, there's WSS3 that it'll work with. It'll work with different things, Foundation, and SharePoint 2010. Those web services is supported by this Codeplex project. Be sure and pay close attention to services. And I got to tell you, yeah, it's completely free, but it is one of the most robust that I've seen on Codeplex. Mark Anderson is very, very prolific and very good at what he does at the documentation, at answering any questions that you have, and making sure that it works the way it should. And he also posts a lot of examples of how other users have put in. You can use it as well. So let me back up there for just a second, because I went to what the web services were, but I want you to see what the data looks like. So I don't really have a pointer that I can show you on this, but what it's doing is we'll just start at the top line and we'll move a little bit down. So we're going to call SPServices, and we're going to pass it to JavaScript of jQuery. We're going to say what our operation is, and in this update list items. And so what we're going to be doing right here is we're going to be updating a list item directly right here. So we're not going to be using our save button in this case, because we're going to be writing it directly out. We're going to be writing it to the mileage record list, and that uses the display name of the list. You could also use the GUID if you want to. You can also be even more specific and tell it specifically where this list is. So if it's actually in another site collection, you can actually write, give it the SharePoint URL to that specific list and do that as well. The next one is async, or you can do that true or false. So you can set this to where it's going to go off and do its update, and the rest of your code will just continue to run because it's doing an asynchronous update. Or you can have it wait and have it do it synchronous. So those are your options there. The next thing down there, a couple of ways that you can do things. You can either pass in value pairs. So for each of your fields, you can say ID, and here's my title, and here's my title, so you can pass it in as an array of value pairs. Excuse me. Or you can actually write the camel that is going to be your update. So in this case, we're actually doing a new. So we're actually writing new data out. The next object item down, you'll see it says complete func, And this is where your data is being passed back in. So it's a callback function that passes the data that gets sent back from the web service along with the status. And then using that information, then you're able to cycle through the data. And cycle through it row by row. Because I'm using an xdata.response XML. The way this is a pre jQuery 1.7, because in 1.7 jQuery, the writers at jQuery create change the way the data is structured, and so you'll see in Mark's code, if you're using a later version, there's a new function. And then what you do is you just iterate through the row one, and so that's what I'm doing here. Is I'm getting the data directly from the row, and then I'm writing it out. And it's from any list, right? So it's any list or library, anything that I can hit through a web service. And then the last thing are the webpart connections. Now remember, we talked about at the very beginning, one of the things you can do with the out-of-the-box web service, if you want to be able to pass in a piece of data, you can do that using a webpart connection. So let's say I had a list of users and I had usernames. I pass that username DataView webpart that goes and hits the Active Directory, and then allows that data from Active Directory. And so another thing that's very helpful with DataView webparts, with the webpart connection, is one of the things that you can do with the DataView webpart is you can set its style to be a drop-down menu. So instead of the example that with the built-in templates where you're doing a multi-item form where it takes all of the data from your list and it puts it in a big table and then allows you to massage it or whatever you want to, and you can go do all your alternate templates. The other thing you can do instead is instead of displaying everything that's in the list, you can say one field, because I'm actually looking at data from a lookup, and so just show me one field, but make it a drop-down box. And so that data, you have one DataView webpart that is a drop-down. When you click on it and you choose an item with it, it feeds that data through a webpart connection to another DataView webpart that then says, okay, well, filter based on that. Let's say that I wanted to look at a list of data that was information. And so I have one DataView webpart that has all of the sales information in a big table, and then I have a smaller DataView webpart that gives me the lookup data from my states. And so I choose Texas in my case, and so I choose Texas, and then as soon as I did, it would send that webpart connection over, and it was my sales data based on the state that was chosen. And so that's the other thing that you can do with the DataView webpart as well. Another, and I only have a slide for this. One of the other things that I love to do with the DataView webpart is to be able to pass in filter data from the query string. It's in and set up to do that. You can say, when you're setting up your filters for your DataView webpart, all you do is you tell it that it's coming from a query string. What's the field that's there, and how do you want it passed into your data? So if I pass in, sales greater than 50,000, for example, and so I say, my sales limit is 50,000, I pass that in as a query string. I set my filter that takes that directly from the query string, and it's all done right there in the GUI wizard that's in the DataView webpart. Then it gives you even more functionality to be able to things and show it. So I feel like this went a lot faster than I typically do, and it probably because of our setup here. I don't have a lot from the audience, but if the audience has the ability to turn on their mics and ask questions, I'd be happy to do that if you have that. But here's my contact information. If anybody direct email, Twitter, And then I also have 2 links down there. One is for my Extending the DataView webpart series. It was a 39-part series that ran on nothing but SharePoint and EndUserSharePoint. And that's just a quick link that will take you and kind of do the search for use all those different those different blog posts. And then there's also a link down there to Amazon to the SharePoint 2010 at Work book. Ravi, I'll turn it back over to you if there are any questions from folks. If you want to either relay them or folks can ask me.
All right, thanks, Jim. Folks on the attendee list, you can ask your questions right now, or you can actually use the chat window to ask your questions if you don't have a microphone turned on. We can wait for a minute or two.
Sure. Thanks, Fabian. And thank you too, Richard. You finally got to sit in on a session. Thanks, Shakir. Oh.
All right, if there are questions, I think we can just wrap it up.
Okay,
And
that sounds good.
give the time for Fabian. I mean, Fabian, if you want to wait, we can actually wait for another 15 minutes and get started on the right time at 10:30.